Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening. We're very pleased indeed, and the press seems to be very pleased indeed too, that our guest speaker tonight is Mr. Lam Woon-kwong, who I'm sure you all know has had a very distinguished career with the Hong Kong government, and he was Secretary for the Civil Service and also Secretary for Home Affairs, and then he became Director of the Chief Executive's Office. Then he was appointed Chairman of the Equal Opportunities Commission, and then in July he was appointed as the convener of the non-official members of the Executive Council. It's interesting that in two of Mr. Lam's positions, I noticed he's been superseded by Dr. York Chow. Is Dr. York Chow going to be Exco convener in some time in the future? Anyway, Mr. Lam is going to share with us his thoughts on civil society development and its relationship with the development of democracy. So I'd like to give a very warm welcome to
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me. Perhaps I should start by making sure about the time slot. I know the session should end by 8:30. So roughly how much time you want me to leave to discussion?
If you can finish by 7:30.
Okay, right. Again, perhaps at the risk of being a bit tedious, I should emphasize again openly that I'm speaking as W.K. Lam as an individual, not representing the government, not representing the Executive Council, nor any other political or non-political agencies. Now, well, tonight I'm going to share with you just some personal observations on the relationship between the development of civil society and democracy. I will try to approach it from a broader angle, and perhaps in subsequent elaboration or in my further Q&A session that you can have a more localized context. Now, I'm a student of social science, so before I talk about anything, I always care about definitions. Because definition is important. Civil service, civil society, or civil society organizations, abbreviated as CSO, actually does not, insofar as I know, have a universal or universally agreed academic definition. Because different people, different organizations, even different governments interpret them quite differently. But I try to be, using the sort of broadest possible common denominator, and I crystallize them into four particular characteristics rather than a definition. First of all, they must be non-government, meaning that they must not be government agencies. That sounds simple enough, but in reality it's not that simple. Because, okay, government agency perhaps is very clear, but what about government-funded or government-sponsored agencies? Now, do you count them as CSOs? Okay. Like all the organizations under the Hong Kong Council for Social Services, most of them are, one way or the other, more or less funded by government. But if we regard them as non-independent, then I think most of them would disagree, because they would see themselves as highly independent of government, although they are funded by the government. So here comes the complication. Okay? And when I was a district officer, for example, in the 1980s, in those days, actually the government was already pretty visionary. We were preparing for the democratization of Hong Kong, and we were actually under orders to have set up multiple layers of government-funded CSOs. And I'll give you some very now common, well-known examples. For residents, we have them to set up owners' corporations under the statute. And in public housing where you cannot set up owners' corporation, then you help them to set up what we now call the mutual aid committees. Now these are resident organizations. The purpose, the defined purpose is to help them to help themselves by having residents' input into the management of these public housing estates and other private residences, so that people can more or less have a say in running their own lives. They do receive a token sum of subsidy from the government, but they elect their own chairman, their own members, and government does not, we might have attempted, but we really cannot control what they say and what they do. So do you regard them as CSOs? We in those days as DO, of course we regard them as CSOs and call them civil society organizations. But I just want to bring out this particular point to illustrate the complications. Of course, besides resident organizations, we were also tasked to set up local sports organizations, local culture organizations, women's bodies. And in those days, that was pretty pioneering. We call them 演藝社, some of you might remember. And they are local women, what we call them grassroots women's bodies. And of course, we also set up local district-based trade organizations and other bodies whenever we can find the room. So that is to prepare for Hong Kong's democratization. So much for government. Now the second characteristic is non-business, meaning again that they must not be, sort of organizations set up by business to help promote their profit or business under the disguise of CSO. But as we well know, all over the world, businesses do attempt to set up agencies that are friendly or that are pro-business, not because they are voluntarily so, but because they have been funded to do so. Now, it's very complicated. It's very difficult to draw a line. It's, again, not easy to, when it comes to the real business, to define what is non-business. And the third characteristic is actually the most important characteristic, as I see it, is voluntary. They must be voluntary. And if they are really voluntary, then I think it overrides 1 and 2. Even if it's funded by government or even funded by business, if they are voluntary, that means they control their own business, they are not controlled by anybody outside their own organization, then they should be seriously regarded as a CSO. But again, who is to define and who is to find out whether they are completely, entirely voluntary? Now, there comes all these complications. And at the end of the day, of course, you don't set up an organization just because you want to set up an organization. It must be for a purpose. And the purpose must be, it may be private or may be public. Most of the earlier CSOs are actually what I would regard as guild organizations, protecting their own professional bodies or semi-professional bodies or their own interests, etc. Or you can even include the labor unions under that category, or welfare organizations such as Gai Fong and other agencies which look after all the refugees that came out of China in the 50s and 60s. But increasingly, some organizations don't just pursue purposes. They may just be talk shops, but they do share some common values and they want to advocate those values. One of the very famous one in the 70s is the Hong Kong Observers. I don't know, Christine, whether you were old enough to have joined that. You must be too young for that. But that particular organization has, actually groomed a few actually very prominent activists. Now, both of them are in the government. I'm referring to Anna Wu, of course, my colleague in the Executive Council, and Christine Law, now a Deputy Secretary in the Environment Bureau. Now, they were very well-known activists in the 70s, advocating freedom, democracy, check and balance of government powers, and they were actually regarded as perhaps in quote and unquote enemies of the Hong Kong government in those days. But gradually they grew to be influential. Both of them took part in the Legislative Council work, and they, if not for their sponsorship of a private member's bill to advocate for non-discrimination on a number of fronts, we would not have the Equal Opportunities Commission now, we would not have the 4 pieces of anti-discrimination legislation. So, you see, all these are the work of our, four sisters who came from CSOs and who, one way or the other, directly or indirectly, helped Hong Kong on the road to democratization, or at least to rationalization of the governance of the Hong Kong administration. Now, how do they relate to democracy? What do we mean by democracy? Again, I must define it first. It's even more complicated to define what is a democracy. If you go to Wikipedia or Oxford Dictionary or whatever, I mean, there are so many definitions. I've chosen the simplest one by Abraham Lincoln. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I think that says it all. But again, in reality, I know of no government that says it's not of the people. The most totalitarian regime on earth call themselves the people's government. And again, I know of no government who claim that they are not working for the benefit of their own people. All governments say they work for the benefit of their own people. So of the people and for the people are really no good as a yardstick to measure whether the government is a democratic one. And that leaves only one criteria, and that's by the people. By the people. Now common sense tells us that when the government is by the people, then in one way or the other, the government should be elected through the free will of its own people. That should be the common sense. I wouldn't say Western or Eastern, otherwise I will get into a brawl over what is meant by universal values. But that should be common sense, elected through the free will of its own people. That's by the people. But even then, it's still subject to argument, but let's leave it at that for the time being. Now, having defined two concepts, again, there are umpteen number, numerous documents, literatures, books, and things have been written about the relationship between civil societies and democracy. The common sort of conventional wisdom seems to be that a democracy should be preceded by a good layer of civil societies. Otherwise, the democracy might not be, how should I put it, might not be strong or mature enough to stand on its own. Because why should that be the case? Why should the conventional wisdom regard civil societies as a prerequisite to democracy? Because democracy really means public participation in their own governance at the end of the day. And if people are not even mature or ready enough to run small parts of their own lives, such as their own residence, such as their own trade, such as their own ideas about certain things, then how could people be mature or knowledgeable enough to run the state? So that goes the logic. There goes the sort of conventional wisdom, and there goes the link. But if we look at the real world, actually the relationship is not that simple. Meaning that a place or a country can have fairly mature, very free, and numerous civil societies like Hong Kong. But we don't have a democracy, at least not yet. And we have seen countries which have democratized sort of within a quick pace of a decade or two without necessarily having a thick or multiple layers of civil societies as a prerequisite. And examples are such as Spain, for example, after the dictatorship General Franco fell. Brazil, for example, when it was under military rule, many, or indeed most, of the genuine civil societies were under suppression. They were regarded as enemies of the state. But once the democratization process goes on, then it actually is the other way around. Genuine democratization of the state fosters the quick development of numerous civil organizations, civil societies. So in reality, the relationship is not so straightforward. But if I were to venture for a kind of link between the two types of institutions, then I would say, personally I would say that the two goes together. Because unless a government is a democratic government, or at least it buys into the concept and value of democracy, or at the very least, because of various reasons, the government has to respect the democratic values, even though itself is not democratic, Hong Kong, okay? Then it would, unless the government is in that sort of zone or category, chances are that they would see civil organizations, civil societies as a threat to the stability of the regime. They would see free-willed, voluntary, formed by the people themselves type of organizations as under high risk of spinning themselves out of government's control. So their reaction, the undemocratic governments, their reaction would typically be, at the very least, to put them under strict surveillance, like Hong Kong in the 60s and 70s, or moving on to the, to the left or to the right, depending on how you look at it, then imposing very strict control on the activities of these civil societies. And further on, even imposing very strict legal embargo on how they can be formed, how they should be monitored, and how they should be funded. For example, very many, even so-called democratic nations, like, for example, Russia, are now putting in new law to limit the extent of their civil organizations receiving what they call foreign funding or foreign financial support. Well, they, of course, have their own reasons, and I'm not saying that just doing that is wrong, but I'm just quoting some examples that, there's this sort of reaction. And in extreme cases, of course, government will simply ban or simply disallow the formation of these type of organizations for fear that they would, really be out of the government's control, and in the end, the people would be able to exercise their own free will and their own activities through these organizations, which at the end of the day, the government may see and will see as a great danger, as a risk to the stability of the state. So, even definitions could be so complicated. So the issue itself, as you can see, is actually very, very complicated. So what I'm going to say, to share with you tonight, is only going to be a very tip of one of the many icebergs. Let's go back to democracy. Continue with this about democracy. I mean, the term actually is a Greek term. Some of you would have known. It means rule of the people. Actually, it goes back to one of the definitions, rule of the people. But of course, in those days, even in the Athenian democracy, these typical Greek cities would have been less than 100,000 people, and typically only about maybe a quarter to a fifth of the people would be allowed to vote or take part in these town hall meetings, because the rest would be either slaves or second-class or third-class residents brought in to work for the city, etc. And women, of course, would be kept out of this particular rank, etc., etc. So it's not really rule of the people per se, rule of like George Orwell said, a certain group of people. But still, compared to the sort of rule of the monarchy, the rule of the totalitarian regime, which is by definition a minute percentage of the entire people, perhaps Athenian democracy is not such a bad idea for small states like the Greek states in those days. But of course, as the empire grew bigger, like in the Roman Empire days, it went on to another form. They formed their own elected council, their own elected senate, which for a time in the Roman history, for a short time in the centuries of the Roman history, actually looked perhaps the most democratic form of government on earth. But of course, it's short-lived. Very, very soon they were overthrown by the military generals who crowned themselves as emperors and ruled like monarchy, like the rest of the world did. But these are the ancient democracies. Other than historical interest, perhaps we don't really need to spend a lot of time on it. But what we are really now talking in modern times is actually constitutional democracy, meaning that the rules of the game, put it in a nutshell, the rules of the game of running the state is set down in black and white, in writing, legitimized through law passed by the legislative assembly, which is elected, and sets out rules that check and balance against each other among the different institutions in the government, so as to, at the end of the day, to aim to protect the liberty and the human rights of the individuals. Now, we should all remember that while democracy, this particular word, means the rule of the people, especially in Chinese manju, it really sounds like, every one of us take part in running the government, in running the state. But in reality, especially when a constitutional democracy was first developed, back in the UK, back in the medieval Britain, in the 13th century, it was nothing like that. The whole concept of democracy, constitutional democracy, was just for one purpose. It's to check the power of the king, check the power of the ruler. Not meaning that we all want to join in to run the country. We all want to sit next by the king and run the whole country. No, they just want to rein in the power, the excessive power of the king, in particular, his power to tax the people. See, at the end of the day, Adam Smith is right. We are all economic people. And we feel the pain when our pockets are pinched by whoever. In those days, typically, the one who can pinch all your wealth must be the king or the emperor or whoever who sits at the top of the apex. And he can just take away whatever you have without having any law, without any excuse. He just took it at his pleasure. And typically, kings in those days or emperors in those days, how could they have spent so much money? Even a small nation like Britain in the medieval times could produce so much revenue that a normal person, even living in extreme luxury, could not have spent all the money. And typically, this is again no west, no east, it's universal. When kings and emperors spend a lot of money, it's only for one purpose: war. They went to war. And they broke the whole nation. Of course, they broke themselves first. And when they broke themselves, and he wants to continue the war, he wants to raise further army, wants more money from his own people, then typically, again in those days, in the hierarchical times, who pays the most? It will be the big landlords, the big aristocrats who owns all the estates, who owns all the slaves, who owns all the farmers working for them. And their pocket would be the hardest pinch. And they would be the strongest one to stand up and say, no. That was what happened in 1215. Absolutely no concept of democracy. Absolutely no concept of human rights. It's just their own pocket rights. And they ganged up, and they had enough power. Of course, the king in Britain, in medieval Britain, you have to remember in 13th century, a British king was actually a pitiful person. He was not very powerful. His so-called big army fighting in France and everywhere was only a few thousand. And he wants to raise it to 10 or 20,000. He would have attacked his own people so heavily that end up he was forced to sign the Magna Carta, which is sort of like an agreement that, you know, I would not raise taxes beyond what you would agree. You know, that sort of thing. So we have to understand all these concepts because it's relevant in my later talk. But actually the Magna Carta was not such an important document at all because it was just a handful of big landlords and aristocrats who ganged up against the king. It was a sort of, you know, small circle fight. The real change actually came about half a century later, when actually King John was the one who signed the Magna Carta, and then his son Henry III. Yeah, my memory's not that good. I think it's Henry III. But he forgot about everything. He fought so many battles in continental Europe. Again, he has to raise a lot of money, and this time he really triggered a nationwide anger, and all the aristocrats and all the big rural landlords ganged up against him. And this time, more than a piece of paper, they imposed upon him a council of parliamentarians to rule the country together with him. So this time they imposed an institution in addition to a piece of paper. So under this particular provisions of Oxford, a council of 24 would be formed, half of them appointed by the king, and half of the others were elected by their own aristocrats and the landlords, a bit like our electrical in those days. And they together rule the nation. They have say over the budget. They have say over the appointment of senior officials like the Prime Minister or the Exchequer or the Treasury, etc. Actually, it's a very powerful provision. But of course, you could imagine, you know, as soon as the king felt that he could free himself of this particular agreement, of this particular devilish in his own will, parliament, then he freed himself out of it. And in the end, civil war broke out, but I won't go into all that. It actually, Britain, I would say, I'm not no historian, and I'm saying it in front of a few British in this room, but I do venture to say that constitutional democracy should have taken place in Britain is actually by a lot of coincidence and by luck. Because Henry III, who of course very soon torn up these particular provisions of Oxford when he could feel he could have the military power to free himself of the aristocrats, he was actually succeeded by a much more competent militarily and ruling-wise, a much wiser son, Edward I, who was regarded as a good king by the British generally. And he, of course, a good king, you can imagine, like our Tang Taizong, a good king would never listen to a parliament, wouldn't he? I could rule so effectively and efficiently. Why should I be bothered by all you stupid parliamentarians telling me what to do? So he threw all these people into prison, he abandoned the parliament and torn up all the pieces of paper. But in the process, he felt that he should actually put down what he was doing in the laws so that he could make sure that his sons and grandsons, you know, would continue to be able to reign like him without feeling the threat of all the aristocrats. So, and in that process, he laid down the common law, he laid down all this judicial process, he laid down all the written parts which forms the early constitutional democracy in this world. So, again, but I could spend hours on that, I'm not going to. Okay, let's quickly forward line the whole process to present day. Now, many academics and others alike feel that we, in the 21st century, with the internet, with all these Facebook and social media, time is now ripe for us to actually go back to the Athenian democracy of our days. That's direct democracy. Now we are so well educated. Everybody knows how to comment on public policies. Now we are so well connected. Everybody can, call up everybody, support me, or don't support the government or whatever. Now we have, by and large, we have a lot more freedom. We are much less fearful of the power of the state, etc., etc. So why don't we go back to direct democracy, the mass democracy? But again, actually, in reality, actually the most mature democracies never really take that step back. I'll go further into that later. But it is for the less or non-democratic states that start to turn democratic, that took up mass democracy. Because typically the story would be that the people, the mass themselves, felt fed up. They had enough of the current regime. They put themselves, it's quite strange, most countries seem to have a big square in the middle of the city. And they crowded onto the square. They lasted there long enough, and the regime, fearful enough not to roll out the tanks, or even when they roll out the tanks wouldn't refuse to fire, then the regime fell. That's the story of the spring of the Middle East, which now seems to be turning into cold winter. Now again, are we going into that direction? I don't know. But let's go back to reality. The reality is that modern states are much more complex, much more difficult to run than, of course, the Athenian states of 2,500 years back, or the Roman Empire, even the Roman Empire. Now, the other side of the same coin, the people are more educated, the people are more knowledgeable, the people are more, have more views to express on various policies, means that views would be much more diverse. Views would be much more difficult to articulate. And it would be that much more difficult for governments, even properly elected, fully legitimate democratic administrations, to be able to satisfy the views, the full range of diverse views of its own people. So that is why civil societies or CSOs, I would argue, become increasingly important, because even the operation of mature democracies require intermediate organizations that can articulate the views of the people in a way that can be digested, that can be taken on board through the democratic process. Even very articulate individuals, when they are in the millions, cannot hope to articulate their views to the secretary, or to the chief secretary, or to the chief CE. Take Hong Kong, for example. We have 7 million people. If you listen to the phone-in program every morning, at least half of us are very outspoken. And we all want our views to be listened to. And perhaps we may, 7 million people, we will have at least 1 million views on certain particular issues. So how are we going to operate? So you do need intermediate bodies, organizations to articulate the key, the priority interest of the public. Now some may say, okay, shouldn't the political parties take on that particular role? Yes, maybe, and of course they do take up certain role, and of course they try, many of them try to monopolize that role, because it would be in their interest to do so. But again, if you take Hong Kong as an example, even before our political parties mature, they were overtaken by technology. They were overtaken by Hong Kong people. Because as you can see, as you can read in the media, as you can hear in various forums like this, many of us speak more intelligently than the political parties can. And it's not meant to be downgrading the political parties, because Hong Kong is a highly educated community. Hong Kong is highly linked up to what's happening elsewhere in the world, and Hong Kong is a highly open, free society. And it's no surprise that many of us, the sort of attentive, reasonably intelligent individuals, can outspeak a politician. So, relying on political parties alone certainly is not going to be able to be sufficient in a highly sophisticated community city like Hong Kong. So you do need other intermediary bodies, and here the civil societies come in heavily. And of course, we also have civil organizations or bodies that specialize in not articulating the interests of the public, or maybe in addition to articulating the interests of the public, also monitor the performance of the government. And some of them, of course, have become international, become very famous, and become highly effective because they are so famous. Greenpeace, of course, is one. I try to avoid name, but I thought it was a good piece of, civil organization turning into a very, very effective agency, feared by many, many governments in the world. So you can see it's almost natural that in the modern days, we actually need a more diverse layer of intermediary bodies, whether you call them CSOs or not, but you do need these bodies to articulate the interests. Now, let me come back to the more reality of life, how citizens relate to government, or it can be the other way around, how government relate to its own citizens. Actually, universally, it's the same story. In the 21st century, with the exception perhaps of really a handful of totalitarian regimes, even the most undemocratic governments in the world have to pay attention to the opinions of their own people, because again, it's the technology that outruns the state. Social media is non-stoppable. Even if you try to suppress all the press, you confiscate all the DVDs or whatever, you cannot stop the YouTube, you cannot stop the video, you cannot stop the social media. So government has to relate to the citizens, and hopefully if citizens can relate satisfactorily to the government, then there won't be any revolution, there won't be any bloodshed or any other form of violence. And typically, in relating it's a three-stage story. The most fundamental stage is to let the people have the information. Don't keep everything secret. And the second stage is, like Hong Kong has been doing for a long time, is to consult. But consult is a kind of attitude, isn't it? I still want to hold on to the agenda. I'm the one to rule, I'm the one to lead, I'm the one to dictate. But out of courtesy, out of need, out of necessity, I consult you. That may be a very forward attitude back in the 70s or even the 80s of Hong Kong. But in the 21st century, if we are still stuck to this particular sort of I consult you, that kind of attitude, then I think we end up with a lot of problems. Actually, the name of the game in modern states is participation, citizen participation. Now here, moving beyond whether a country is democratic or not, actually citizen participation, because the citizens now know so much, is again non-stoppable, almost inalienable. One way or the other, you've got to allow citizens to participate. And again, at the risk of being tedious, it really enables a better development of public policies. It builds greater trust to the government, and at the end of the day, it makes the democracy more stable and stronger. So active citizen participation should be the rule of modern governments, not consultation. But of course, typically, in private or even informal or on all sorts of occasions, you still hear our officials say this. We are overloaded. How long can we consult? It's never ending process. There's never going to be any conclusion. Is that the case? I would say the answer is not whether you should enable citizen participation, because, as I said earlier on, there's really no choice. You've got to go for the game. with this particular principle in mind, that is to enable active citizen participation. So the question is really how? I mean, at least 10, but it could be 20 or 30 in this particular ways of, engaging the citizens. And I don't invent these. I mean, they take place elsewhere, especially in the Nordic countries, for example, which typically are very open with their own people. And I won't go into all of this. Some of this actually we have been adopting, like inclusion of CSO representatives in consultative bodies. My only observation is that perhaps when we did a lot of that back in the 80s and 90s, that was good enough. But with the current accountability system, actually I'm disappointed to see that some of the major advisory bodies are now being chaired back by the officials again. So actually the trend seems to be a bit going back, although the CSO representatives are still there. Tripartite commissions, it's quite common, our labor advisory board is one, so that's no need to discuss. Focus groups, yes, we use it from time to time. Theme workshops, seminars, and conferences. I still remember the days when, the chief executive or the former governors, they used all these summits. Remember, Christine? So summits. What's the purpose? Only 2 hours, call it a summit, but it serves a purpose because it serves to show that the chief executive or the governor, number one in the government in Hong Kong, is very concerned about this particular business. That is why they call a summit. And that immediately brings a lot of attention, gives the subject a lot of priority, and immediately wakes up the officials dealing with the particular subject that this is a priority. So it serves its purpose. Now, what else? Multiple citizen survey. I say multiple because now most of the surveys are not up to standard, I dare say, now. OurTV.hk is now working with Hong Kong U on a new scheme of consulting the public, which I think is actually going quite near to these models. That is, they pick a representative sample, representative of the population of Hong Kong. They give them informed information. They survey them before, they survey them afterwards. But actually, mature democracy, these multiple surveys can actually go on. The purpose is not trying to see if people change their mind. The purpose is really to educate the whole, population so that we all know what the controversy is about. So I hope we would be going on further. Now, expert panel hearings is again in that sort of direction when you have a panel appointed. Well, it has to be by the government, I would say, but they are independent experts who are experts on that particular policy area under controversy or where you want to push. And they come out, express their views, and let the public decide in an open hearing process. And other countries run the secretary's open hours, where the ministers or the secretary, every week, for example, they set aside a couple of hours, and everybody can come in and say whatever they want to him or her. And then the others would be consensus conferences and citizens' juries. Typically, this would be a sort of debate forum where, again, elected, a sort of representative sample of the public sit hearing all the to and fro's of the arguments and then making the judgment at the end of the day by the citizens' representatives themselves, thus giving the government a more accurate picture of what an informed public's view is. If you just go onto the street and say, do we support X and Y, most of us would probably for the first time ever heard about that particular question or term, and you can imagine the quality of that particular response. And it would be so easily swayed by vested interest as well. Now the last point I really want to mention is about referendum. Actually, referendum is very common throughout the world, especially in democracies. Some of them are binding, meaning that the decision would, by law, bind the state to act accordingly. More others are non-binding. The whole purpose is to really let the government know what the mass public really feel about certain controversial issues. Now, I don't know why the word referendum in Hong Kong should be so sensitive. It actually is no more than just a mass expression of the people's will. It's even less sophisticated than the earlier provisions such as consensus conferences or citizen juries or expert panels, but it does give a degree of legitimacy.
It's because it's too much like it as a suffrage.
Maybe. Now, but of course, referendum has its own limitations too, because the turnout, you cannot control the turnout. If you have a turnout of, say, 30%, does that give you the sufficient legitimacy, even if it supports the policy, to go ahead? May or may not. So it does have its own limitations, but what I want to say, it's actually quite a common tool used by many governments in the world to try to proceed with the controversial issues and to set the direction. So, going back, active citizen participation has to be the name of the game. And all government must take it seriously. The trouble is that many governments don't take it seriously. Many governments just pay lip service to active citizen participation, either because they feel it's inconvenient. Because what if you say something that I don't like? What if you say something I cannot afford? What if you say something that makes the whole administration extremely inconvenient? What if you say something that if I proceed to do it, it will bring down my government? So all sorts of reasons. So take it seriously sounds easy, but actually it is the most difficult part to proceed. I might take longer than 7:30 now. I must proceed. Now, again, I use 10. I can go 20 or 30 bad habits of government. But 10 is a good enough number. And this is a crystallization of my own 30 years of government, involvement in government. And I shared in a lot of these bad habits too, okay? I say this to round up how we can overcome these bad habits. Now, first of all, is the risk-averse culture. Now, not only the Hong Kong civil service, I would say, most civil service, most government in the world is vulnerable to this particular, bad habit, risk-averse culture. Just play safe, play very safe. Don't think the unthinkable. Everything has to be within calculation. Everything has to be, the best it's been done before. Don't go beyond the limits. Then, of course, how common this is, preconceived answers. Even before we start to consult, we already have the answers. But we know we have to go through the consultation process. So you see, some of the consultation documents are written in such a strange way that you would wonder why it should be written like that. Because the answers are already written in between the lines, and that really give people a bad feeling. So actually the good AO, the good writer of consultative documents would be able to avoid this particular mistake. But it doesn't mean that we don't have the preconceived answers. Lack expertise and capacity. You may wonder why. Government is so rich, government is so strong, why should you lack expertise and capacity? Yes, government typically, most governments, I would say all governments, share in this particular weakness because technology and the world moved too fast for all governments. We just cannot catch up. Capacity, all governments are subject to budget constraints. All governments don't have a deep enough pocket. So the capacity is always limited. And all governments don't practice hire and fire. So people, when even they are beyond their own use by date, they stay within the government, although they lack the capacity to cope with the new situation. So that is very typical of most governments. But the answer is, for Hong Kong government at least, we tap on the consultants. But the consultants, I can tell you, share the same problem too. They pretend they have expertise. Well, now again, seeking the easy way out. I would say this is more the risk of democratic government than the pre-democratic Hong Kong government. In the old days, when it was largely run by the civil servants, we are trained not to do this. We are trained to really go through things step by step. But after democratization, you can understand why politicians want to jump to conclusions, because they need to give you the answer within 24 hours. Otherwise, if it becomes a headline on day one, and by night you don't have a line to come out, by tomorrow you would have an even harder hit from all the press. So, pardon them. Inertia, again, this is almost 100% weakness of all governments in the world. Inertia doesn't mean that people are lazy. Doesn't mean that civil servants don't want to do work. When I was a civil servant, I worked my guts out. I worked typically on average of 12 hours a day. But I'm still subject to this particular risk because taking risk, going beyond the line, going into uncharted waters, carries with it a risk that you think your boss is most unlikely to take. And my boss, of course, also thinks that he or she would most unlikely to take. So, layer by layer, we stick with the safe option. So, when you are at the top, when you are at the very top, and that I say most of you are not in the government, but whatever organization, when you are at the top or when you're going on to the very top, make sure you have some option given to you, not by your own hierarchy. Make sure you have some outside options from some of the most strange people in town. Because otherwise, you would run the risk of also being seen as inertia at work when you actually want to find creative solutions, but you don't have them at hand because nobody gives it to you. Then again, this is more Hong Kong government sin, the market at work. When things don't work, we blame it on the market. When things work, we track it the market. When people push us to do something, we say let the market perform, etc., etc. Well, that's not wrong, I would say, because we have to remember Hong Kong government, now even the SAR government, is very small economically. The power is very small. No mature, rich governments like us, at our stage of close to 40,000 US dollar per capita GDP, no government in that sort of range only spend 20% of its GDP through the government. Typically, the OECD, even the Singapore government who cheats you to think that they are spending less than Hong Kong, they spend typically 30 to 40% of the GDP, which means that they can at least control quite a substantial side, a proportion of the economy when the Hong Kong and SAR government cannot and did not. Okay? So when you say, how can the mainland government do things, build a high-speed railway so quickly, and we have to spend 6 years just building a link? Don't blame the government so easily because we are not that powerful. But be that as it may, sometimes I think we use the market as an excuse too conveniently. For example, like on retirement protection, we always say, people saving and whatever, the market at work, etc. Ignoring the fact that our minimum wage only came in year before last. Before that, it was really market low wage for a third of the working population in Hong Kong. And for this 1/3 of the working population, it's hopeless for them to save because they just do not have the capacity to save. And I think Christine can testify into that. Then, of course, again, all governments are vulnerable to this. Vested interest at work. Whether democracy or not, vested interest would try to work on the government and try to sway decisions in their own favor. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean corruption. It doesn't necessarily mean collusion between the government and the business. It's just the name of the game. Again, it's proper. It's open sometimes, less open at times. But vested interest trying to sway the decision of the government to their favor. And some of the vested interests, by definition, are very powerful vested interests. So there is also the risk. I think in decisional work, we seem to be increasingly under this particular risk. We consult and consult and consult. Who can tell me how many times have we consulted on healthcare reform? Yeah, maybe. I can't remember, I must say. And we are still at the same stage, meaning government is trying to support an unsupportable system, unsustainable system. Now, since Dr. Goingman is now at this 80% popularity rate, I hope he could do something about this. And sometimes it's the other way around, haste at work. And I can tell you, this is no state secret, but actually the modus operandi of AOs. Typically, when you say draw up the policy address or the budget, especially the budget, secrecy is so important. You mustn't let the cat out of the bag, because if it appears on Oriental Daily or on some other press, before it comes out, the boss will blame all of you. You know? So everybody keeps them to such a high state of secret that they don't share among the bureaus and the departments when they should be. And typically, you would have seen examples, quite recent ones, I won't quote them, that when the policy comes out, it quickly had to be withdrawn because it was not well thought through. Nobody really thinks through the nitty-gritties of it. Nobody really thought through the whole process of implementing it. So there we are. And this is the last point, paralysis. You know. And sometimes, you know, now it's paralysis, I would say, because nothing gets passed through electrical. And that is, you know, close the gate to the money and to the legislation, which are so essential to making policies work. So how are we going to break through this? Okay, so how are we going to break through all this? Well, with 30 odd years of public administration experience, I can really confess to you that policy making in the real life is really a very messy business. It's totally unlike the standard textbooks that some of you might have read if you have taken up a Master in Public Administration course. It is also not like the sort of case studies that you might have picked up in the typically American university type of course, because the reality is even more messy than the case studies themselves. When they write the case up into the case studies, they have screened out a lot of all these things that they don't want you to see, or they feel it's too embarrassing for you to discuss in class, even in class. The reality is really very, very messy, a lot of mistakes, a lot of hiccups, a lot of, you know, lost in coordination, a lot of miscommunication, a lot of backwill, a lot of embarrassments. So how did Hong Kong, you know, become so successful despite all of this? It's workable. It's workable, provided we hang on to some of the key factors. We might still make some mistakes on the way. We might, you know, have a few embarrassments on the way. But if we stick to some fundamental principles, if we are serious about enabling active citizen participation rather than paying the lip service or just playing the sort of fake consultation game, the job can be done. The job can be done at the price of, at times, embarrassment to the government, meaning that you may have to take back certain policies after consultation. It could mean a lot of inconvenience to the government, meaning that you would have to make major alterations to what you are proposing. It may even mean that sometimes you're going to have to spend a lot more money than you think you can afford, but that can always be accommodated by phasing in the implementation process if you're serious about it. So things can be done, back to my earlier point, if we are serious about it. Now OECD, you know, has publicized these 10 tips for action. What did it say? Take it seriously, start from the citizen's perspective. That sounds easy enough, but sometimes we write consultation papers not from that perspective. It's more from the government's perspective sometimes. Deliver what you promise. Watch the timing, because you cannot consult forever. Be creative. This is very difficult. Remember what I said about being inertia, having the inertia at work, being playing safe to the boss, etc. Balance different interests. You always have to do that because you cannot satisfy just one sector of the populace and not the others. Be prepared for criticisms. By definition, if you want to be a political minister, you have to be thick-skinned. Doesn't mean that you should, you know, just face the criticisms with a smile. It means that you have to admit that certain policies are wrong-footed when the public tells you so. Even though you think the best policy in the world. But when the public tells you that it's wrong, then you have to admit that it's wrong quickly. At least it's premature if you want to save a bit of your own face. Involve your staff. That's very important. Some of you might have seen the Yes Minister. You're old enough. And some of you would have seen the Yes Prime Minister series, which is actually quite brilliant too. You have to involve the professionals in the process. Politicians are a different breed. They have different competencies from civil servants and professional people. You need the senior civil servants and the professionals to really build the machine, develop the nuts and bolts and make sure the machine works. You don't promise a machine that doesn't run at the end of the day. So involve your staff is extremely important. Deliver a coherent policy. Of course, you don't allow your ministers to say one thing on this side and then on the other, say something contrary. And the last point is like the first point. It's obvious. Act now. Don't just say it. Okay. I'll use this last 10 minutes to run over a case example of success. I have case examples of failure, but it's always good to publicize the successful example. Otherwise, we would end up, with a very gloomy view of the future, which I don't want. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. The wheel has been invented quite successfully before. In which particular episode? You've heard this before. The 1991, we started to plan for the Kai-Tak area, what to use for the old airport after 1997. See, the old regime was actually quite visionary. Back in 91, they started to do it, but now it's 2013. Okay, we have the first project ready, almost ready. The cruise terminal. That's 20 years, 20 odd years. Okay, what did we do? What quickly run through the history. 7 years' time, we developed the outline zoning plan, which of course the first stage in the town planning process. It proposed a massive reclamation in the harbor, and the public immediately screamed, quite rightly so. They don't want to see another East Kowloon, another concrete jungle in Kai-Tak. They don't want to see another West Kowloon, a whole big piece of virgin land filled by highways, which nobody can cross, just for the cars and the buses. And what about history? Chen Yunhan, FTU, was the strongest advocate that you mustn't forget that Kai-Tak, old Kai-Tak, has a lot of history to preserve. And what about Tim Ford, who has advocated for a replacement for the highly faulty Hong Kong Stadium? If the government had listened to him, we wouldn't have the embarrassment of the fouled up soil ground last month. What about Mega Venue? In Kai-Tak, that's the only virgin land in town that we can have. What about cruising? What about cruise terminals? None of that was ever mentioned in that particular 1990 outline zoning plan. So naturally, Mr. Tong took the advice. He was humble enough to throw the whole thing back to the town planning board, start again. Dutifully, they started again. This time they took less than 7 years. And by 2002, they published another outline zoning plan, which took into account all of the major facilities, lessen of the density, but they still want to fill up the Kai-Tak Lala. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, now this was the model. If we had proceeded with that particular plan 2002, but then because somebody took the reclamation issue to court, and the Court of Final Appeal ruled that there should be no more reclamation in the harbor area unless it's compelling, of overriding need, unless there are no viable alternatives, unless it only caused minimum impairment. Of course, the 2002 plan didn't fit any of those categories, so again, the whole thing has been put back to the drawing board once more. Now this time, the Secretary for Development, he actually took a very open-minded approach. He was not embarrassed. He was, going back to the 10 bad habits. He was actually prepared to really restart the whole thing with a totally open mind. He brought in all those opposition groups and bring them together one house. with a very inclusive, what they call the Harbourfront Enhancement Committee, and bring all the heads together. You know, these are CSOs that are opposing reclamation, enemies of the government, so to say. You know, some are business friendly, but then all these are against reclamation laws. And even the Conservancy Association is a very outspoken, conservation CSO, etc. But at the same time, they bring in the other stakeholders too, the tourism board, all the professional bodies who should be involved. So everybody who wants to have a say, have a chance to say what they want. Instead of a deadlock, instead of a totally uncompromisable position, they actually turn up with a very satisfactory compromise because all the sectoral interests self-balance against each other, and there was no division, and then actually there was a consensus. And because we invited so many bodies to sit on the board, the civic society's capacity was fully tapped, and everybody was doing it with extremely goodwill, and at the end of the day, turned out a very satisfactory result. And of course, the Secretary was open-minded enough to make sure that the process was not only open, but seemed to be open. He engaged for the first time ever in government's history, then, a private consultant to undertake the entire consultation process. Typically, in old days, it would have been a civil servant serving as the Secretary and doing all this consultation, which many of the non-official members see as biased, or too tend to control what members say and think. But they engage a private consultancy to do it, and all the meetings with the minutes are open. Anybody who wants to sit in and listen can do so. All the papers, everything is accessible on the internet as soon as it is out. So it's a fully transparent, open process involving all the parties, all the stakeholders. But perhaps one of the also very important factors is that we put in a positive and trusted player as the chairperson. Professor Lee Chok-fun of the Hong Kong U. At that particular time, he was the Deputy Vice Chancellor. He's himself an engineer, but he's not known to be activist. On the other hand, he's not known to be speaking for government all the time either, so he's trusted. And he served a very positive role in the whole game. Government allowed for more than 2 years, 2.5 years, to really let the wheels be sorted out, put in millions of dollars to enable the process to go on. Thousands of people attended various expert panels, public forums, and speak their mind, watch what the new models are going to be. And in the end, the most important factor was that the Bureau then did not have an immovable agenda. They are prepared to take on what the committee is going to recommend. Even though it's going to be perhaps housing less people, perhaps more expensive to develop, they think they can deal with the consequences. So in the whole process, it not only arrives at a consensus, but a great trust and credibility for all the stakeholders and for government. And this was the final outcome, 2006 Outline Zoning Plan, which translated in a model is something like this. And you've now seen the first big project, the cruise terminal now, due to be officially open in October, with the rest of the other projects to follow. This is another view at night. But that's why when I read about these rumors in the press a few months ago, that people might be starting to rethink about the Kai-Tak plan so that it could house more people, so that we might have to throw out this mega entertainment sports venue, then I said to myself, no please. Because this particular project, some of the officials might not have remembered, might not be involved. This particular project has its own history. It has gone through a very positive process, and you mustn't, and you cannot just undo it because you want more housing. You may go through another process of this kind, but that would be another, I don't know how many years. So luckily, that was, the rumor was dropped. So that was a very successful civic engagement model that really works. You can forget about all these small words, but basically what it said, the most important thing is government was serious in engaging the stakeholders, even though some of the stakeholders are not pro housing, are not pro-density, are not pro, the least money spent, the government is prepared to take the consequence for a serious, open, genuine consensus. And they make sure that the process and procedures would be not only be truly open, but seen to be open, so as to build the trust for the players to really take serious part in it. Because if the players, at the beginning, they suspect that you are trying to play games, then you would have a very different process. You would end up having a very divisive product and no conclusion at all. So actually, all bureaus, I could suggest, could learn from that particular lesson to try to break through all the current deadlocks. Actually, we have done something similar for waste disposal back in the early 2000 and something. Then the Council for Sustainable Development, chaired by Christopher Chang, Chang, adopted exactly the same process in a slightly different way, but also came to a very open and fully satisfactory answer to all the stakeholders. But the unfortunate thing is that the government then and subsequent governments did not follow through that particular report. And now we end up with this particular, dialogue, paralysis over waste management. So, what should we learn from it? What takes it to work? It's openness, serious engagement, be inclusive. Don't cut out those that you feel are your enemies or inconvenient to you. Commit to honesty. And of course, all this could only be done if there's genuine commitment from the very top. Otherwise, people just do their own thing. But having said all that, I think real life experience tells me also that the stakeholders, the players in the game itself are also very important. While we should be inclusive, while we should be engaging, but if we have stakeholders or players that are radical to the extreme, that are totally unprepared to compromise or to listen to others' views, that only want to play their own game, whether they want to be a hero or they want to be so obsessed with their own particular views, then again, you could also come to a deadlock situation. So that is why it's also very important to have the right sort of players and stakeholders in the game to make sure it works. But there, again, it comes to a very tricky question of how you choose the players. Now, I've overdone the 20 minutes, I'm sorry. I guess that's what I want to say tonight. I must emphasize again, there's only one man's view, and it's only about the tip of the iceberg. There's so many other things about CSOs and democracy that we can talk and discuss about, and I cannot claim to be the most knowledgeable person in this room. I'm sure many of you would have your own views, and I'll be very happy to have the remaining session to share the views among all participants in this room. Thank you.
Dr. Kay, thank you very much indeed for your very extensive and comprehensive thesis on civil society organizations and democracy. Although, given the last part of your talk and the emphasis on the engagement progress, I'm rather wondering whether you're not softening us up for a longer life in Hong Kong without democracy and how to deal with it. Anyway, I think we now open up to questions, so who would like to? Yes, the gentleman.
Can I ask a question in Cantonese?
Yes, please. Yes.
Please feel free to ask in Cantonese, no problem.
先生好多謝你今日嘅講題，你喺業界裏面好多經驗嘅。咁我想問下，或者好呢個問題同呢個 CSO 或者同嗰個事冇直接嘅關係，但係我睇到嘅嘢就係關於呢個佔中問題、佔中環嘅問題，係咪呢個政府目前同埋呢個嗰啲市民係有做多距離咧？即係頭先林先生講過呢個consultation 啊、communication 啊，呢啲嘢都係好重要嘅。咁點解呢個佔中係會發生咧？同埋佢係咪可唔可以避免嘅咧？我個人就唔想睇到佢係會發生嘅。咁政府應該做啲嘢，佢應該唔做啲咩？咁因為我覺得呢樣嘢如果發生咗係對我哋香港成為一個好 minus 嘅 image 方面亦係好影響嘅，或者比上林先生你咁長嘅政界經驗，幫我哋啲advice我哋
answer in 10 minutes.我頭先一路嘅分析咧，都係公民社會同呢個民主制度嘅運作之間嘅個關係。咁裏邊嚟講咧，其實我有一個 aspect， 有一個方面我都冇掂及到嘅，就係政府與公民社會或者政府與民眾之間嗰個信任。喺任何一個政府，無論係民主與否咧，其實民眾同政府之間要建立呢個信任咧係好重要嘅。但係呢個本身，呢個信任本身一樣嘢咧，亦都唔係即係講就有，你係需要一個比較長嘅時間，民眾去觀察政府。咁調翻轉頭咧，都政府如何去對待民眾？咁樣係一個反反覆覆嘅過程裏邊咧，然後先至建立起某一個程度嘅信任。咁而呢個信任咧都係相互，咁亦都唔係一個固定不變嘅一個標準嚟嘅。有時嘅信任度喺呢個所謂順風順水嘅時候，就係以前嘅高啲。如果去到譬如經濟衰退啊，或者係個社會面臨一啲好分裂性嘅議題好似譬如即將來臨嘅政改嘅嗰個諮詢咁樣咁就好可能咧嗰個信任度又會係改變。咁所以呢個議題嚟講咧，本身都係高度複雜嘅。咁就算講翻公民社會咁樣嚟講咧，你話公民社會同群眾之間嗰個信任度係點咧？我哋一路淨係講緊政府喎，係嘛？嗱，而家其實公民社會與公民社會之間，其實自己都互相有好多不信任度，甚至乎敵對嘅情況出現。咁所以呢個議題咧係一個好複雜嘅一個議題，唔能夠好簡單咁説得清楚。信任呢樣嘢，我只可以話用一個好個人嘅一個咁樣嘅睇法。其實我哋每一個人都可以由個人自身嗰度去做起。譬如你作為一個舉個例子，一個社會活動家，你去希望推廣你一啲政治上嘅信念，或者唔係一定政治嘅一啲其他嘅信念，啲環保啊之類嘅時候，你首先要問自己，你係咪真係信嗰樣嘢？如果你唔係真係，而係為咗其他原因而去推行嗰個咁嘅信念咧，你通常就會出現一個問題係咩咧？就係你到上下唔係好記得自己嗰個立場應該喺邊度，咁於是你就會出現咗一啲前言不對後語啊，或者一啲立場嘅模糊啊、矛盾啊呢啲咁樣嘅情況。咁然後咧，跟住你嗰個公民社會啲群體或者其他嘅群眾睇落去咧，就會覺得怪怪嘅。咁所以其實我就會覺得，即係話你翻返去我頭先講公民社會，公民社會一個好重要因素就係話佢真係自願性嚟去推行一啲佢哋自己信嘅信念，或者去推行一啲價值觀咁就所以喺呢度嚟講咧，如果各個公民社會嘅團體喺譬如用翻政改呢個例子，喺嚟緊嘅政改都係各自去追尋翻佢自己個理想，根據佢自己嗰個信念嚟去做呢個工作。我只覺得係唔會有大問題，唔會有大問題因為你睇任何一個最民主嘅社會都係一樣，係會一個 spectrum， 即係喺個政光譜裏邊我中意做政治光譜啦，好闊嘅即係有啲人佢係信小政府、笑低稅、信政府要保守、信政府唔好干預人嘅生活、信小政府大市場，但係亦都有其他人會信社會主義好。政府應該盡量去協助人民去生活，政府應該盡量去作為一個道德嘅模範之類嘅。咁喺一個自由開放社會嚟講咧，係一定會有一個咁樣嘅 spectrum。所以如果大家都尊重呢個咁樣嘅信念嘅話咧，而基於一個咁樣嘅平台去討論咧，其實最終嚟講唔會有100%嘅 consensus 都好啦。至少大家唔係應該要有一個所謂惡感或者對抗性，唔一定要係咁。 所以我會覺得而家喺香港呢個階段咧，其實最值得做嘅咧，與其話推銷某一個民主嘅 model， 反正要反覆提醒翻大家民主嗰個價值觀其實係咩？當我哋點解要講民主咧？其實民主就係我哋希望一個制度裏邊咧，有足夠嘅空間俾好多人都可以喺度 happily 咁樣去過活嘅。就算我唔認同呢個主義都好啦，我都會覺得我仍有我嘅聲，我仍有我嘅票，我仍可以影響下一屆嘅政府。但係就算我影響唔到下屆政府，我至少唔會三更半夜俾人收咗去，我至少唔會無啦啦走咗，因為我嘅政見唔同佢坐咗監，我至少唔會各種各類奇怪要發生喺我個人嘅安危嘅身上。咁所以如果你用一個咁樣角度去睇，其實我哋如果唔同嘅公民團體有唔同嘅政見、唔同嘅表達方式、唔同嘅推動，其實係好正常嘅一回事。但係最緊要大家就要翻去最終，如果你大家真係信民主嘅話，唔信就唔使改政改啦，唔使講添。如果你真係要玩呢個 game 嘅信民主推動香港繼續民主化嘅話，大家第一件事就要復興翻民主嘅最基本嘅價值觀。基本價值觀就係，就算我唔同意你嘅講法都好，我都會尊重你講嘢嘅權利，我都會尊重你表達意見嘅權利，我都會俾你表達呢個意見。咁最終嚟講，個決策嘅模式，你甚至都可以唔係好認同而家有嗰個決策嘅模式但係你都要喺一個尊重現實嘅情況之下，用你最大嘅理性和平嘅手段去爭取改變呢個模式而唔係一定我講就係啱，你講就係反對，咁就好難。我亦都拉翻我頭先講呢個 civic engagement，the players 係需要一啲係好 rational、好能夠 accept， 至少 understand 人哋意見嘅人，至少肯 listen to 人哋嘅意見嘅人。如果連嗰個組都做唔到咧，咁你就好難會有一個所謂 accommodation， 好難會有一個 consensus。咁而家當然你話就算好 mature 嘅 democracies， 你睇其實都係會出現呢啲咁嘅間歇性出現呢啲咁嘅好 difficult 嘅情況。Look at Washington 你睇華盛頓就係以一個咁 mature 嘅 democracy， 佢而家係可以兩黨極端到連個 budget 都搞極都過唔到咁滯，到而家其實技術上都仲係冇過到，只不過係冚住兩個有錢使。即係當然我哋唔講美國嘅例子，佢有好多好複雜嘅一個咁嘅情況。但係其實如果我哋睇呢啲例子，並唔係話個 lesson 並唔係話咁我哋唔好搞 democracy， 而係我哋反而應該要學喺搞 democracy 嘅時候，點解唔好各走極端？呢個就係我自己嗰個。Maybe I should just repeat briefly what I said, very briefly. The question is about the forthcoming political reform debate, about Occupy Central, etc., and what's my view on that. And I say it's actually very acceptable and should be acceptable in an open society for different political views to be advocated. So long as the advocator, as the CSO advocating their own different political views, play the game by the rule of democracy, meaning that they should be prepared to at least allow the others to say their piece, try to understand the others, and let the whole process be debated fully and openly in public, rather than insisting on their own views and blame or condemn or label all the others as or reactionaries, and blame them as enemies of the people. If you adopt the latter attitude, then there would be no reasonable ground to compromise, and that would go against the principle and values of genuine democracy.
But the trouble is, it's always one side that's asked to compromise, not the other.
係啊，林滿江先生你好，喂，我首先多謝你之前咧嚟我哋公開論壇咧就講關於保護中華運動啊，咁就我本身就係中港青社聯創會副主席陳玉娥，即係我今日咧，其實我之前喺8月22號咧，我就上過 ATV 就講關於呢個反佔中嘅。咁其實點解我會反佔中咧？我知道今晚你哋嗰個議題咧就係講普選㗎嚇，就講個民主嚇。 咁其實我想講話民主咧，今時今日喺香港咧，其實係唔係一個時候，唔係一個即係氣候唔啱啊！即係呢個 moment 咧，我哋個政府最重要搞乜嘢咧？最重要解決我哋好多好重要嘅 urgent 嘅 issue， 就係解決 housing 嘅 issue， 就唔係話去講其他。你哋講 democracy 民主係全世界都講呢樣嘢，但係喺香港，因為香港唔係本身係回歸咗，唔係一個獨立嘅國家，係喺另一個 area 嚟嘅。咁我就首先我係喺講之前咧，我有少少嘢想講翻實，我真係唔想講，點解有時候我攞張紙咧？因為我想講嘅嘢快少少，係 point 到 point， 我亦唔想嘥大家太多時間。我想話，譬如有啲人搞普選，其實喺大前提嘅啲選民咧，佢係點得 all win 嘅？點解咧？即係我都係我哋個會其實好支持民主嘅成熟嘅發展，但係冇來喺呢個社會上咧，唔排除好多政客咧。佢為咗借呢個普選同自己嘅政黨係要利益鋪路嘅，美其名就為人民，其實就想打擂台就搏上位，即係有名有利。佢打贏咗，佢就同即係攞埋啲行政資源谷大支嘅黨係咪？佢打輸咗，佢可以又可以叫啲支持嘅加碼係咪？咁其實因為佢背後本身其實佢出嚟玩嘢，佢間後面有好多利益嘅集團啦係咪？咁啊點都係可以即係抽水嘅我哋啊！咁我哋係咪我哋啲市民係咪應該要留意呢樣嘢咧？咁我想講話，譬如普選真係點解香港係唔適宜咧？因為其實你香港係回歸咗㗎啦。咁我哋香港係絕對喺呢個 moment 係唔適宜美國嘅制度嘅。係啊，即係我成日話，即係我哋本身係反佔中嘅，即係我覺得你哋唔應該。即係你哋搞，因為你哋點去佔中？因為你講普選啊嘛，你講民主啊嘛，咁你引致到而去佔中啊嘛。我呢個係其實係問題之一。你哋由頭到尾你講緊一個民主，點解你講佔中？只係因為你哋要民主，所以搞佔中。呢個係你哋想講嘅樣嘢嚟㗎嘛。但係問題你要冇人，其實全香港市民，我哋都好 welcome 好多人。我哋係可以出嚟去講呢樣嘢，但係你唔應該，你可以好多，譬如我自己講，啱啱8月20號上去 ATV 講完之後，好多人拍咗手掌，好多人真係唔知道咩叫佔中啊！但係我講完之後出嚟個拍到，哇，係喎，點解佢要去佔領中環啫？佢哋要去佔領維多利亞公園，點解唔去佔領維多利亞公園？冇騷擾有人哋，因為你喺度佔領中環咧，好多人即係翻工翻學。你係打爛自己個地方，搞壞自己。我哋香港點解可以仲係今日咁成功啊？因為我哋係已經係一個。
可以盡量問翻個問題，因為你已經講咗你話係支持佔中嘛。係啊，但係你問阿林生嘅問題係乜嘢？
我就話譬如，第一我真係覺得阿林煥光先生真係好威，你嗱唔係點解香港人真係好硬？
有冇問題問？
佢就唔係好 micro，佢好 macro 去睇嘅。
如果你冇問題嘅話，我諗
有啊，梗係有啦。譬如我覺得阿林煥光先生好犀利，佢唔係淨係講單方面，佢講嘢好全面性去講嘅。咁譬如我而家話我想問阿林煥光先生，譬如你對於而家現時班人咧去講呢個佔中咧，咁譬如佢哋點解唔可以大家和平去有個方法，大家和平去講，或者你可唔可以好多朋友都話點解你唔去維多利亞公園啊？或者你去遠翻少少天水圍都得㗎，係咪？咁點解你哋唔去傾咧？就冇騷擾其他人，你去即係政府而家做緊嘢，做緊解決房屋問題啊嘛。多謝林煥光先生唔該。
好，多謝。
Thank you so much. Sorry to say in sorry.
即係個問題都係清楚嘅。不過我諗而家呢個議題咧，都喺社會上都係正係經歷緊一個辯論嘅一個過程。公民抗命是否犯法等等呢啲各方面嘅議題咧，都係喺度好頻密咁樣辯論緊。如果我哋用一個正面角度去睇咧，其實純粹呢個議題本身咧，我都會覺得對我哋成個民主進程嚟講都有教育意義。因為我諗喺呢個議題未提出之前咧，大家對於公民抗命啊，對於其實2017我哋可以進行普選啊等等咧，都未必會醒覺。 咁所以無論大家係正面或者負面去睇呢個議題咧，我哋都可以喺個議題裏邊學習到，令到我哋他人民主化呢個進程裏邊咧，我哋係更加具備呢個民主嘅素質咧，嚟去做我哋下一階段嘅工作。
Thank you, Mr. Lam, for sharing. Actually, I quite appreciate your willingness to be outspoken within the government. I mean, to me, you're just one of the rare species. You keep emphasizing the participation and also the openness and valuing the differences and diversities. I used to work in the public sector. I understand all the bureaucracy. One of the major reasons I left is there's a growing tendency for public servants just listening to the top. I mean, working according to what they perceive as the top leaders' preferences, without really going into the public. I mean, listen, the bottom part. I mean, the public and people in the front line. So I was getting more and more worried about this kind of tendency. You know, so I wonder, given your vision about really engagement, I think within the system, I'm not just talking about within government and the civil society or the public, the three parties. I'm talking about within the system, even within big bureaucracy, within civil service, NGOs. There's also this kind of tendency for people to just manage upwards, right? So I would really like to see how we can really push more forward within the system to be more open, to allow, those in the middle and down in the bottom, without fear, to share their views and differences, and that instead of just praying a lot on the leaders' interests or preferences.
Thank you. The question actually is quite complicated, and it deserves a seminar on that. I worked my way up from the most frontline staff all the way to being a secretary. So in some ways, I think I can say that I can understand the psychology. When I'm at various stages of my position in the hierarchy. Now, at the front line, when you're very junior, you always try to stick to the rules and regulations. That's understandable. Even your own boss, no matter how good he or she thinks you are, you probably won't be allowed much discretion on the street, enforcing the law or undertaking exercises. But I still can remember in the old days when I reached mid-ranking, like for example when I was a district officer operating in a district, a district in Hong Kong is typically bigger than many cities in Europe. For example, when I was in Sha Tin, it was 500,000 people. Okay, a district officer doesn't really care much genuine executive authority, but I could do a lot of things to influence a lot of local decisions. I could twist the arms of the police superintendent at the district. I could go straight to the district land office and say, you mustn't do that. I could speak to the district social welfare officer and say, can you be a bit more humanitarian? I cannot dictate him or her, but I could influence, and I did. I enjoyed my role as a district officer a lot because I felt I made quite a bit of difference to the daily lives of the people in Sha Tin. It could be very minor, just moving a bus stop or having an additional halfway house for the mentally handicapped, or resolving a CSSA case a bit outside the sort of strict ambit of the rules. It's things like that, but I enjoyed it a lot, and my boss then allowed me to do that. My boss was Ian McPherson. I saw him last month, and I still quote this particular direction back to him. When I went out to the district office, all he said to me was, WK, you do what you want, but when things went wrong, you'll be the one to be blamed. I said, fine, sir. That's all I need. I would take the responsibility, but then he gave me a lot of free hand to do that. And that is good management, good administration, good governance, I would say. Because if you push all the decisions all the way up, as unfortunately now, increasingly, there's this tendency, then a lot of things get stuck in the process for too long. Because you could imagine when things go up, it takes a long time to reach the real boss who could make the decision, and it comes all the way back. The one at the front line would feel very aggrieved. So even now, I still encourage the system to really grant more discretionary power to staff, who of course they must have the necessary experience and training to undertake that, but discretionary power is very important. You have to couple it with a lot of other things, etc., especially training, but that is very essential. But why did civil servants increasingly seem to be refrained from undertaking these discretionary decisions? That's largely because of the politicization of the whole process. Now district councils, despite whatever some of the media and other critics may say that they are just talk shops, but they exercise genuine influence. May not be genuine power, but genuine influence. They will stop. For example, if you want to put a halfway hostel for mentally handicapped in a public housing estate, you cannot do it now, because all the district councillors in those areas will say no, no, no. And they even now say no to elderly homes. It's gone so bad, But I would really say, and I think the chief executive agrees, that district problems should be resolved at the district level. And I think he said it openly, So I hope he would really get the Secretary for Home Affairs to really implement it seriously through the district officer system, because I think that system was designed to do exactly that. Don't let, decisions go all the way up, and don't let the grievances be accumulated. Let them be resolved at the district level. So I agree with you. I really want to see the whole system be loosened back, despite all the political power of the district councillor, despite all the aggressive media, despite all that. District officers should be brave enough and have the good common sense enough to undertake and try to convince his own colleagues in the district to undertake discretionary decisions for the benefit of the people. But it takes, again, commitment from the top. And he has to take it seriously. The secretary has to take it seriously. For otherwise, the district officer who is a mid-ranking official only may not have sufficient guts on their own to do that.
Well, thank you, WK. You talked about the policy making is messy, but I can tell you the civil society is also messy. Having worked in the civil society for 30 years, I think I'm confident to tell you that, especially looking at what's happening now, those who claim to be civil society. But I do see that the point of the strength of civil society as an important element of democracy. But one thing you mentioned at the end of your good case example is genuine commitment from the top. Do you see that the government has a genuine commitment in growing the civil society? Be it civil society and civil society organizations are different. Civil society organizations may be facilitator, intermediary for active citizens' participation. And this is the point why we need to invest in civil society organizations. But do you see this commitment from the top in that? You mentioned about in your days, at that time, the government was building civil society organizations at the grassroots. It's no longer there. You mentioned civil society members appointed into consultative bodies. but they are there with special emphasis that they are on personal capacity. Civil society organizations to function, they have to reach up, reach down, and reach in. But I don't see, or if you may say, this commitment from the top to actually grow and create a space for civil society organizations.
Thank you, Christine. You really touch on a point that I didn't dare to touch. Yes, you're right. There are civil societies and civil societies and civil society organizations and civil society organizations. Some of them are just one man or one woman band. Others are not genuine ones, and others have other agendas. But I still believe that given our generally free environment, and the statistics prove that 98% of the applications to register under the society ordinance got approved, which means that the hurdle is actually very low. It's free for us Hong Kong people to form ourselves into meaningful civil society organizations to articulate our interests, to pursue citizenship participation. But it's up to us, up to ourselves. Otherwise, there could be other organizations or other bodies that steal the agenda, steal the organization, and try to swing the game to their own way. Now, I hate to see that, but the reality of a free organization, the other side of the same coin is that people are also free to do that too. Back in the year 2005, when I was still in the Bohemia Foundation, it's supposed to be a think tank, we commissioned a study. I think Professor Joseph Chan of Hong Kong did an excellent report, and one of the very important points he recommended towards the end of the report was that although Hong Kong does not lack CSOs, they do lack the assistance to build up their capacity. Most of them are financially or HR-wise not strong enough to be a sustainable and meaningful CSO. Many of them are just volunteers who are already, how busy Hong Kong people work. We work on 40-hour days, 40-hour weeks, which is the longest in the world. And that, of course, is an understatement for most of us in this room. And how difficult it is to save up to buy even a small, medium-sized property and all that. So, but we still see a lot of people who have the heart and the wish to try to do something. And I'm particularly heartened. Maybe it's a biased experience, but I was very heartened when I worked at the EOC, the Equal Opportunities Commission, and I see a lot of the sort of 30-ish, 40-ish, this 70後, 80後, who in the middle of their very busy career, even some of them at the peak of their career, they took a step back to work for the greater good beyond their own immediate benefits, And there are increasingly this younger generation that is coming up that are willing to invest part of their life for the good of the others. And all it takes is just a little more encouragement, not even necessarily finance, but just a little more encouragement, such as Professor Joseph Chan recommended, have some training, for example, give the CSOs the moral and other encouragement, organizational encouragement, so that they know they are being valued, so that they absorb more of them into the proper engagement channels, such as advisory bodies and others, so that they know that their views will be listened to. And it won't take a lot of attention, it won't take a lot of resources from government to do that, so long as they are serious. Now, I cannot answer that particular question. I've led the government for 9 years, so I don't really know what Upper Albert Road is regarding this as, whether they are regarding this as a priority. I don't know. I did recommend it to the previous administration, the Donald Tsang administration, but I don't think he paid any particular attention.
I can give you the answer to that. They're not interested. And the way you can see that is through the current conversion of all GIC, available GIC sites to housing, which is depriving the community of any possibility of having any space to do anything. I went to Town Planning Board just a few months ago with regard to the plans to demolish Middle Road car park in Chinsau Choi. Apart from depriving us of public parking facility at a time in 2013 when in 2016 the gates are going to open and we're going to be flooded with mainland cars. We put forward objections saying that if there is spare capacity there, then it could be used for community to build rooms, little function rooms, places where people could gather, and to fulfill some of the functions that are missing in our community, things which we are entitled to actually under the Hong Kong planning guidelines, and we were turned down. I'm going to town planning again in a few weeks with regard to the plans to turn the only two available sites, GIC and GIC sites in Mong Kok, into housing. So, you know, where are these groups supposed to meet, to get together and to get to know each other and to get support and to grow, like you just recommended?
Thank you. I think I know what you are saying. As an executive councillor, we do have to give the final stamp of approval to the final recommendation of the Town Planning Board. And I tell you, those papers are voluminous. Every single representation is laid down in great amount of details. And we do have to take a long time to read them through. And I read each and every page through carefully. I understand what you are saying. On the other hand, of the scale is of course this great and unsatisfied demand for housing, which in the short term we have to find extra land to do it. But then I can assure you, in the first instance, I think of my own experience, the Town Planning Board is perhaps among the most open system of engaging the public. You really have quite a few opportunities to do in the whole process. At the end of the day, you may not get what you want, but still, I think it is one of the most open processes. And secondly, I can assure you that even within Executive Council, we are actually very mindful of the needs of the other sectors. Now, GIC land, I come back to my point. When resource is in demand, it's in short supply, we need to be creative. We need to think out of the box and not follow what has been handed down for generations type of options. Why should GIC land be usually they only build 2, 3 stories, 4 at the most 6, when you could actually build 10 or 12 and accommodate many more different type of facilities and needs. And on the other hand, I criticize the district councils, although they are the most democratically elected bodies. I criticize the district councillors for being very localized and very short-sighted, because it's not the shortage of land. The GIC facilities are not built now. It's not that. The land has been identified. It's the local objection to so many of these welfare institutions that many of them are regarded by these politicians as obnoxious, when actually they, in time, will probably need them. That these are not built. I use my UOC example. Mentally handicapped. They have all the money, they have all the land allocated, but absolutely no endorsement from the district council for building these hospitals and rehabilitation centers and all that. Increasingly, even the elderly institutions, even the institutions for the mentally handicapped children, etc., are regarded as obnoxious. I mean, what kind of world is this? We have to educate our politicians that they are all part of us. We do have these children have to look after. We will get old and we will have to live in these institutions. One day we may be unfortunate enough to be handicapped mentally or physically, and we'll have to be taken care of. Why? Why people have to like that? And I think government must have the backbone to stand up against all these unreasonable interests.
Last last question, sorry.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Lam, for sharing your views without apparently violating the executive rule of confidentiality. I hope. I have two short but hypothetical questions. The first one, I'm sorry, I have to go back to the Occupy Central movement again. Now I'll make it very short and from a different perspective. Now, just now you mentioned about this referendum as a useful tool to gauge public opinion, and I got the impression that you're in support of referendum in general. So I'm just wondering that given the Occupy Central movement is such a controversial and divisive movement, should there be, or would you be prepared to consider in your personal capacity maybe supporting a referendum on this issue, let the majority win, okay? That's my first question. I know it's not really very realistic, but I'm just sort of putting you on the line. Now, my second question is again to put you on the line. Now, in 2017, we will have the CE election. Would you be prepared to consider running for this post, given your long and distinguished civil service record and your political experience? Personally, I think you stand a better chance than Mr. Leung. You do a better job, So if not, why not? Thank you.
No, actually, your first question reminded me of an article that I read a few days ago. It was written by Professor Lui Dai-Lo. You read it. A long article, but it's well worth reading. For those of you who haven't read it, I do recommend it to you. I think amidst this debate, Professor Lui has once again used his very perceptive and clear-minded thought to make a suggested way out of this particular messy debate. And I think I will answer your question by stopping at that. Now, the second question does not require an answer. I'm too old and I'm not ambitious enough to run that sort of post. Thank you very much.
Okay, one final question.
Well, I got to declare my own interest first. I'm a businessman in real estate, security and entertainment. I just want to ask a question, It's very simple. What is the incentive for the CE in Hong Kong and also the government officials in Hong Kong to strive for the interests of the Hong Kong people instead of getting up the ladder? Very simple.
Thank you. Yes, your question is simple, but it's perhaps the most philosophical question for the entire evening. I can tell you honestly that throughout my 30-odd years of public life career, I actually keep asking myself this particular question. Why? Why am I there? What am I doing here? I cannot claim to be objective because when you try to answer your own question, you try to rationalize a lot of things that you are doing. So I cannot claim to be entirely objective. But I think it is fair to say that people do not necessarily behave or pursue certain activities purely for their own personal interest or for own personal sake. Now, I'm not saying that this job has not done me well. I mean, I must honestly admit that this is a very well-paid job, being a government official in the government. This job offered me a lot of job security and all that. But the other side of that particular coin is that actually I mean, I say it seriously, for the 30 odd years that I worked in the government as an administrative officer and later as a politically appointed official, I rarely work less than 11 hours a day. I rarely. It's a hard life. Even when I stop working, I have to worry about a lot of things. Tomorrow, day after tomorrow, year after next, etc. So it's a job that actually took a lot of my energy, a lot of my family time, a lot of my other interests. I'm a very curious person, I have a lot of interests, but I don't have the time to pursue it until my retirement some years ago. So it's a job, why should I be doing it so seriously? And I just thought to myself, maybe the thought of doing something useful to others is vanity enough to keep me going. I still regard it as a vanity, but it's a good vanity, I would say. And I would like to think, actually, many of my colleagues working in similar jobs, especially those that grew up with me in the civil service, actually, I think, shared very similar thoughts and values. You know, in the old days, before the politicians appeared, we had to shoulder on quite a lot of the political responsibility, and that, sir, I can tell you, vanity apart, it brought a lot of heavy responsibility on our shoulders. It's a very heavy job. Worrying about criticisms, whether I would embarrass the government, whether I would be regarded as somebody who is really doing negative things for the public, etc. Would I be wasting my life being an official and all this sort of thing. It really worried me. But I think at the end of the day now, even saying it now, several years after my retirement, although I'm still serving in a semi-retired capacity, I say it's all worth it because I was lucky enough. I was really lucky enough to have served in the period when Hong Kong was under great change, under great flux, not just economically, but also politically. We have seen how the whole city has progressed and transitioned throughout all these last 20 years, the ups and downs and everything we're lucky enough to see and to be part of it. We might not have done a good enough job. I certainly have not done enough of a good job despite my hard trial. But I think it's fair to say that we tried very hard to put our heart at it. And I would like to think that my colleagues are continuing with that sort of mentality too. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for taking so much time, spending so much time with us tonight and sharing your views. And thank you everyone for coming and spending time too. Thank you very much.